This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Flare, a leader in providing actionable cyber threat intelligence to companies and governments around the world.
Today, we welcome Beth Sanner, a career CI analyst. Beth worked on a wide variety of issues during her career. She was a presidential briefer, and she concluded her career as a deputy director of national intelligence as the intelligence community's top analyst. Michael, Beth, and I will talk about the national security challenges facing the next administration. We'll be right back with Beth and Michael.
The lines between geopolitical risk and cyber risk are blurring. Flare is a next-generation, continuous threat exposure management SaaS platform that equips corporate information security teams with world-class collection and continuous monitoring across dark web cybercrime forums, markets, Telegram channels, and sources of geopolitical risk. Flare sets up in 30 minutes, creates actionable intelligence from hour one, and is used by governments, security teams, and threat intelligence teams around the world. You can try Flare's free trial at their website, flare.io. That's flare.io.
Welcome back. Today we have Michael Morrell and Beth Sanner, and we're going to take a look at what the national security challenges are that will face the next president of the United States. We're recording this a few days before the election, so we don't know the outcome. But regardless, we'll sort of do a once over the world and talk about what the biggest challenges might be. And, I thought we could, if you guys agree, I thought we could just do this, by region, just so it would make some orderly sense. I know that's the hobgoblin of small minds, but I need to organize things.
Well, that's at least two of us. I would not put Beth in that category.
I'm probably gonna defy that regional breakdown from the get-go, because that is not our world, my friend. But okay, I'll play along.
Okay, but before we sort of start, going, sort of region by region, one of the interesting things that we've talked about a little bit in the past, but might be interesting to sort of get everybody's views here, would be this. I don't know if you want to call it odd, but this relationship between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. This is such an interesting mix. I mean, if you had told me, given the old job that I used to do, running like weapons analysis, that the North Koreans and Iranians were providing weapons to Russia, I would say you're out of your mind, right? But that we see that, and we see this, China stepping out about their relationship with Russia, et cetera. So what do you all think about that? I don't think this group has a name, collectively, but what do you all think about this sort of four-way relationship?
Does it have a name? Beth?
I don't know if it does.
They're about four different kinds of things that people, axis of authoritarians. I like CNAS. My friends at CNAS call it the axis of upheaval. Which I kind of like, because it's the goal, right?
Yeah,
it's the goal
it's to disturb the world order.
Exactly. So
yeah.
I feel like that one's kind of a good one of describing the purpose without trying to make it into something it's not.
Are these I don't know the answer to this question, or I would be saying it. Are these bilateral relationships largely, or is there any place where they actually come together as a group?
So the only place they come together, no, they actually don't ever come together, because North Korea is not part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is, kind of the place where you see Iran, and Iran is an observer as well to BRICS. But I think that they're mainly bilateral. Maybe there have been a couple of trilateral type things, but it's mainly bilateral. Yeah. And so to me, it's, but they're all kind of happening at the same time. And you can see a lot of linkages between the goals, what they do for each other, how they back each other up. And in the disinformation space is the place where I think you see so much commonality. You're seeing the same messages at the same time, and, they really reinforce each other. But I mean, for me, I think that, we can kind of overplay it into something that it's not. But I always think about things in terms of the practical effects, right? And so why do we think that this is bad? And it's bad because by working together, by having each other's backs, each player is stronger as a result and emboldened and no longer isolated, right? So the pariahs, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, are no longer isolated, and they're much more emboldened, and the three of them are stronger. And the commonality there with China is that China economically is what is enabling all three of those through its economic support and its refusal to uphold sanctions. And it's just so interesting to me that just a few years ago, we had Russia and China and us, we were all working to contain and prevent proliferation in Iran and North Korea.
Right.
And now that's all gone.
Right.
Right. And so it makes it a lot harder for us to accomplish our interests, I think, and it makes our adversaries stronger. And it's prolonging the war in Ukraine, the Russian war effort, and all these countries are destabilizing their regions together with the sole aim, not the sole aim, but the primary aim of undercutting us so they can shift the balance of power toward them.
Yeah, and it's not just shift the balance of power, right? They all have specific goals.
Yes.
And in large part, they're all revanchist goals, right? They're trying to achieve something they had in the past. Mm-hmm. Whether that's sort of imperial Russia, whether that's, China 100 years ago, when they were a much more bigger regional player and global player, Iran when they, had regional influence, or so they want again, North Korea, hard to say whether they want a united Korea, right, under their governance, or whether they're just trying to, maintain themselves. It's harder to say for them, but everybody wants to achieve something in their region, where they live, and they need to undermine the United States in order to do that.
Yeah, and they need to push the United States out of their regions in order to do that.
Yeah. Beth, when you said, let's not overplay this, or maybe we shouldn't overplay it. I forget what your exact words were, but when the war in Ukraine started, I was concerned when not only these countries supported what Russia was doing rhetorically, but a lot of other countries in the world as well. And then it moved right from that rhetorical support to actual material support, different in the three cases. Mm-hmm. And now we've got North Korea sending troops to fight in Ukraine. And
then the reverse flow of what Russia's doing for them.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Then I start to worry about, where does this end?
Yeah.
Right. This is kind of how world wars, and again, I don't want to overstate it either, but in the back of my mind, this is how world wars, start. Countries start supporting each other like this in exactly the ways we're seeing, and it evolves. And am I over worrying what I just said? Am I overstating what I just said? Or is this something we need to pay attention to? And Andy, you too.
Yeah, Andy.
Yeah, look, I don't think you're over. I don't think you're over worrying it. I mean, the cooperation, because I don't see, none of us see intelligence anymore. But I don't know what the depth of the cooperation is, and how organized it is, and even if they have slightly different goals, what we said before, the diminishing the United States is a common goal, regardless of whether it's in Europe or Asia or the Middle East. So I don't think you're over worrying it, Michael. I do think that when Russia needs to bring in troops from North Korea, that doesn't sort of tell me that there's a particularly strong Russian military. And you've already seen some snippets of Russian soldiers saying, "What do we do with these people?" Right? Because they're not trained in the kind of combat that the Russians are doing. So, I take Beth's point. She can elaborate, of course, but I think it's worrisome. But I don't think about it in World War kind of ways.
China does not love what Russia and North Korea are doing. So it's not a cohesive group. I think Anne Applebaum used the phrase that it's not about ideals, it's about deals. And I think that that's right. But then if you go back to the practical effects, like I kind of, I do not love the line that the Pentagon and the White House have been putting out that this shows how weak Russia is. I don't know. I'm not like, I don't want to be too contrarian there, but I think that is just kind of a throwaway line. I mean, I don't think that Russia is doing this because they're trying to build up, because they need those troops. I mean, these North Koreans, the numbers, they'll last about 10 days on the front lines. I mean, that's how the attrition. I don't know if that's what it's about. For me, I don't worry as much about what this means for the Ukraine theater as it does for the North Korean threat. That's where I'm at. Because we know from what the U.S. government has said that Russia is sending, technical support to North Korea on a number of areas, which only make them more a threat in terms of their ICBM, in terms of building out their what do you call a dyad when you have two, Andy?
Yeah, I guess that's right. Dyad, yeah.
I have no idea what you guys are talking about.
I'm talking about not like they're building out submarine. They don't have air power, but they have missiles and submarine threat in terms of nuclear power. So we really need to pay attention to the North Korean threat. And this is only making them in actual terms, in real things, more capable. And that to me is concerning. But, China doesn't love that, but they're also not going to stop it.
Do we see the same thing in terms of Iran or not as much? Russia helping Iran build its capabilities?
So, there's some discussion about what Russia's already given to them, but I've been awaiting this strategic treaty between Iran and Russia that's been in the works for a while, and there's some talk of it being signed when Pezeshkian is going to Moscow for a state visit in the near future. And so what's in there matters, right? And again, we have reports from what the U.S. government says of that they are sending technical support. I don't know whether Russia's willing to just not care about proliferation in Iran. But if they give them, advanced fighter jets, if they give them, more technology, that's not good.
Yeah, but one thing the Russians are going to be hard pressed to provide Iran is cash.
No, right? No one's doing cash.
Yeah. Which
Gold.
Is something they desperately need. I mean, if you take a look at the economic numbers, and I know they've been bad for a long time in Iran, but, it's sort of, the Chinese could do that, right? The Chinese could provide that kind of an influx.
The Chinese are buying other oil and keeping that economy going. So, yeah, for sure. I guess for me, it's just look, Iran has a decision to make about whether they're going to go for a nuclear weapon. And the real question for me, and I'd love to hear you guys what you think, but the real question for me is what has just happened? Does it make it more likely or less likely for them to go for a weapon because they no longer have, their rings of security?
Right.
I personally think they're so exposed now in terms of their air defense that I actually think that they are not inclined to do that. because if they get caught, they're going to get bombed. But, it's a complicated question, and there's a lot of infighting right now in Iran.
Yeah, I think, your point about, Beth, losing what they have long seen as how they deter Israel and how they deter the United States, right? Hezbollah's capabilities and its missile program and Iran's missile program, right, as being how they deter people from attacking Iran directly. Those are both gone, right? One is shown to be ineffective now. Its missile program, right, ineffective on two separate cases, two separate, events, and Iran has watched Hezbollah's capability be significantly destroyed in a matter of weeks, right in front of their eyes.
Yeah.
So how do they? I wonder if they think that their deterrence has been weakened. Just because it has doesn't mean they think it has. Yeah. And if they have, then are they thinking of how do we reestablish deterrence? And they at least have to be discussing whether now is the time to acquire a nuclear weapon, in order to do that. Wouldn't be surprised at all if there are different voices around, their version of the sit room, right? The SCNS. The Supreme Leader, has been risk averse for a very long time, but doesn't mean you stay risk averse. Some of his language in the last week even has been, more suggestive that he's open to it. So I'm sure they're talking about it. And, the question is, this discussion that we've had so far, right, on all of the issues we've talked about so far, sort of is our understanding of how the world works. But ultimately, the question becomes, what can the U.S. do about any of this, right? So on this question is, what can the U.S. do to ensure that Iran doesn't go down that road? So I think there's a real risk here that they're gonna say we have to do this, and we got to take that risk very seriously and do whatever we can to dissuade them.
Well, there are no technological hurdles left, so it's not as if we make a decision and then we spend the next 18 months or 2 years trying to build out the program. They're already there. And so, a decision could come and they could begin to move relatively quickly.
Yeah. I'm wondering, here's what I'm wondering, guys, and maybe this is a question for you, Andy, is the, three legs to this, right? You know this better than anybody. Three legs to this: fissile material, weaponization, and delivery. The fissile material, could we wake up one morning and it's gone from where it's currently stored, which we know that we know where it's stored because the IAEA, has looked at it for so long. Could we wake up one morning and it's gone and not know where it is?
I don't know. I mean, could they surprise us? Probably, maybe. Could they move all the fissile material without us having a clue? I don't know. I'm just a little less worried about that. Look, of those things, the having fissile material delivery systems, argue they've got sort of those capabilities. Weaponization has sort of been a bit of a long pull, but the question is, if it's if you think you're going to get a 5 kiloton yield and you only get a 1 kiloton yield, was that a failure? No, right? And so you've got to play that a little bit. That you may not weaponize it as well as somebody else could, as well as the U.S. or Russia or China, but as long as you're getting yield in a nuclear weapon, which takes the genie out of the bottle at that point, right? Which that's the other point of this. I just don't. I'd say they've gotten so much from just walking up to the line and just sort of standing right there.
Yep.
That once they cross the line, they might be weaker than they are with just a threat that we're going to get ready to do this.
That's kind of where I've been at, in that, being a threshold state is actually a pretty powerful position to be in, and they've certainly used that pretty effectively with the international community, although not effectively enough to get sanctions relief, really, which is what they want. But I do see this as this is going to want to be one of the big issues. I think that the Biden administration figured out that they couldn't negotiate their way out of this in terms of a JCPOA 2.0 because the program is not like it was during the first round, right? It's way far beyond that.
Right.
And I personally think that everybody's agreed that just doing a nuclear deal isn't where we should be. You got to deal with the whole panoply of threats.
Yep.
And if you just try to break that off, you're not getting enough. But I think that Iran is so weakened right now that there is the potential for somehow getting to the negotiating table, but you can't do that without using the threat of force. We have to be able to we have to, you can't just get people to go to the negotiating table and agree on a whole range of diminishing their threat, because that it creates vulnerabilities unless we have kind of the power of the coercive power of military force behind us.
So this is not right, them just, we're not in a static situation, right? So Israel is going to continue to push, in my view. We're not done here. The consequences of October 7th are going to continue to play out. Israel is going to continue to try to reestablish a sense of security, to put a new defense strategy in place because the old one didn't work on October 7th. So we're not done here. So Iran will be reacting to what Israel continues to do in Lebanon, and what Israel further decides to do against Iran. The pager operation, as it is against Hezbollah, Mossad, didn't put that in place with no focus on Iran, right? You can imagine what might be in place via the Iranians going forward here. So there's more to play out that will ultimately affect how Iran thinks about all this.
I mean, this is just one of the absolutely key issues that the next administration is going to face, and it is not easy. On the good part, Iran is so weakened, right? Hezbollah is so weakened. Hamas doesn't pose a threat, but yet we have all of these other things going on in terms of what are our strategic interests, what do we actually want to achieve. And we have these pesky Houthis who seem completely undeterrable, and we're expending billions and billions and billions of dollars shooting down missiles. They just popped off a bunch of stuff today, and and that is not going to end. And so, I really feel like this position that we're in is not really sustainable in terms of U.S. interests. But we seem to be pretty much driven and constrained in many ways by what Israel is doing and about the existential threats that they feel.
Michael, you're a frequent traveler to the Middle East. What's your sense about their views about U.S. involvement or lack thereof?
To be candid, everybody I talk to in the region says we're not a player. We're just not a player. Because there's a view there that despite our rhetoric, we are never going to use our leverage with Israel to change their behavior. The only leverage we really have, which is our weapons deliveries to Israel. We're never going to use that leverage. And the other view is that we are only going to use military force for two reasons and never outside those two reasons. And the first is we will use it to defend Israel from attack, and we will use it to defend ourselves, our own troops in the region. But that's it. We won't use it for any other purpose.
This is what we call deterrence by denial, not by punishment.
Exactly. So the view is we're not a player. And, back to Beth's point about, this is not heading where it needs to go. The point I would build on there is that Israel has had amazing military success, but military success by itself does not achieve strategic success. You always need a political piece to it. We would not have destroyed German and Japanese fascism, nationalism, without the political piece that we put on top of it right after World War II.
Right.
Without the recovery efforts that we did in both countries. And there's none of that here. Nobody's talking about that here. Nobody's talking about day after in Gaza. Nobody's talking about day after in Lebanon. Nobody's talking about a political solution to the Palestinian problem. The U.S. is the country that is most capable of doing that, and we're absent. So, without that, even with this great military success, without that political solution, we're going to be right back at this in 10 years, right? With a different group in Gaza, probably maybe called Hamas, maybe called something else, same in Lebanon, maybe called Hezbollah, maybe called something else, and Iran's going to rebuild itself, strengthen itself, find ways to strengthen itself again, and we're going to be right back at this.
So you're describing a bit of a vacuum, right? But do you guys find it interesting that no one has stepped in, to take advantage? China,
right.
Unless China has, and maybe
No.
I've missed something, but they haven't in any significant way, which sort of surprises me.
That's just it. It's like, we don't want to be the world's policeman anymore, but there isn't anybody else to take that, and no one else will touch it. And people want a free ride on it. I mean, the Red Sea shipping, the United States doesn't have a lot of, we're not the ones that are suffering the most from that. China is, and they're sitting there in the Red Sea watching us and how we operate. They're getting a lot of great intel, but they're not doing anything, and they're not going to. I mean, yeah, so I do think that, the Biden administration has tried to talk about two-state solution. They are engaged on Lebanon and trying to use this as a way out. But you just don't get the feeling that, anyone in the region is picking up what they're putting down, right? It's just not, there's no real traction there. And of course, almost all Israelis hate the idea of a two-state solution. So, and, a lot of Palestinians do too. So, yeah, this is exactly what people who want to shift to Asia don't want to hear. But this is like another sucking sound.
Yep.
And it is incredibly complex. And I think that it is, like you said, it is not going to go away. And so the next administration is going to have to figure out, how do we manage this without literally hemorrhaging our capabilities? Our readiness.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Beth and Michael.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Can I use that cue about shift to Asia? Just because I think there's a couple things we didn't really touch on.
Yeah.
One is the general threat that China poses, and the not only militarily, economically, technologically, it's sort of on all fronts. And then I guess the second part of that is Taiwan. Because the next administration will be in that 2027 window, and we can sort of talk about whether we believe the 2027 window or not. But now you've got a China that's pressing all fronts that may go kinetic, if you believe some people, in the next 4 years, which creates a whole different dynamic in East Asia. So I guess it might be worth just what do you all think about the rising China and the threat it poses to the United States?
Beth, do you want to go first? No.
she's saying no, not me.
You're the Asia guy. No, I have a lot of thoughts, but
yeah, so do I. But go ahead. You're the guest here.
I think that there's a temporal nature to threats, right? That there's stuff that you have to pay attention to right now, but if you can't miss the ball on what's happening, down the field. And so, this show's about what the next administration's going to face. And I worry first about what are they going to face in this kind of transition period. And I remember, Michael, I think maybe you were the head of analysis at the time, and you charged all of us with making sure we're paying attention to adversaries and activities in each of our spaces to make sure that we were really laser focused on any efforts by anyone to take advantage of this very delicate time in our political calendar that happens every 4 years. And so I do worry about China and their activities in the South China Sea, maybe not, as well as Taiwan. They've been trying to set a new normal in all of these spaces, right? And in Taiwan, we're just seeing them do, more and more and more from the last exercise, which was really practicing this kind of blockade. Coast Guard ships now operating, new air routes operating close to Taiwan, and the number of crosses over the median line just off the charts. What could they do in this period to, again, just kind of up this is normal? Are they going to really, really push the Philippines hard during this period? Because as treaty allies, and we have publicly said, we're gonna come to your defense. What could they do there? In the last week, we've had the Chinese really active in Indonesian waters around the Natuna Islands, and the Indonesians having to chase the Chinese Coast Guard away as they're trying to do these seismic testing that they're doing there as part of developing their natural resources. I do worry that, especially with the Philippines, potentially with Indonesia, that they could really push some things to the point where we have big decisions to make. What are we going to do? And then longer term, we just have the whole huge number of issues from, Chinese nuclear development and trying to keep up. And so much of that has to do with U.S. competitiveness and what we are doing here at home. Yeah. But we're going to have tense relations with China and very, very tough policies toward China, no matter who comes in. The real question for me is, whether we're going to have alliances to help us out of those things, or whether we will be going for kind of bilateral deals in order to deal with the China threat.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think what I would add is that Xi does not want to have to use military force vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Agree.
He wants to build up such a massive military capability across the straits that a future president of Taiwan, future leadership of Taiwan, and even a future leadership in Washington will look across and say, we got to find an accommodation. That's what he wants. Mm-hmm. Military force will be a last resort. In terms of the military activity that Beth talked about elsewhere, South China Sea, Philippines, Indonesia, that's an effort to get them ultimately to side with China rather than with the United States. And there's a real risk that the next Philippine election, I don't know, it's 2, 3, 4 years. I forget
2 or 3 years. Yeah.
That we could get a Philippine president that takes the Philippines in a completely different direction. Right, and that's the kind of they're trying to pressure these countries both militarily and economically to come to their side of the fence and not be on our side of the fence. I think some of our alliances there are absolutely solid. Japan, Australia. I think some of them are in real question, like the Philippines and Indonesia, and what side they're ultimately going to be on. And even in South Korea, if a fight breaks out between the United States and China, is South Korea going to really be on our side, or are they going to sit it out? Because a third of their GDP comes from their economic relationship with China. So where are they going to be ultimately?
And what government is going to be in charge in South Korea?
Exactly.
Yoon is not doing very well.
So, I think I worry more about the South China Sea and a miscalculation by the Chinese, the Philippines, us, Japan is now down there as well. I worry more about that in the short term than I do about Taiwan in the short term. Although we are going to see intense military pressure, on Taiwan in terms of the military exercises the Chinese do. But that's not intended to start a war.
Right. I do think that this miscalculation thing is absolutely very clear and present. We shouldn't forget about the pressures going on in Japan, too, around the Senkaku Islands. We've just seen a lot more activity there. We're seeing the Russian and the Chinese do a lot of joint exercises and circumnavigating Japan, and with Japan's politics now just completely up in the air, I do see China probably taking advantage of that to add pressure to that situation at the same time that we're going through ours. So we can't forget about Japan. I think North Korea is the thing I worry the most about Asia in terms of something going wrong.
What do you think they might do? What are you worried about?
Well, it's not that long ago in history where North Korea sunk a South Korean naval vessel, bombarded a South Korean island, killed people.
Civilians
and sailors.
Yep.
And that is in very recent history,
yep.
Right? And so
it's how
think
Kim Jong-un established his credentials.
Exactly.
With the security services.
Exactly. And now, he just moved 250 artillery launchers close to the border. He's put his troops on high alert. He's blowing up all of the roads and bridges and rail lines between North and South Korea. And we've been waiting for another nuclear test for a while. And now the South Koreans are looking at what's happening in Ukraine. And I see real shifts there in terms of their willingness to kind of join Japan in seeing the linkages between these theaters.
Yeah.
Which is why I said in the beginning, I don't want to break away, because these things are really linked.
So this is not a dynamic that China wants.
Right.
Right. And a North Korean attack on South Korea would bring U.S. forces, so on and so forth, right up close.
They want to do the opposite. They want to
yeah.
get us off the peninsula.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But they have allowed North Korea. I mean, they seem to allow it, allow them to sort of blow off steam, but not too far. You know, and maybe we're overestimating China's control. I'm not sure they have that much control, but they do. You know, fuel oil and all those things that are absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
You know, for North Korea to get through the winter, and fertilizer and all those things. You know, come from only one place, and they come through or from China. And so they even though sometimes they'll say, well, we don't have control, they sort of do.
They do if they're willing to do something about it. And I think that what we've seen in the last 2 years is that they're no longer willing to do what they would have done before. So the question is, like, how far will they go in trying to rein them in? And could we have some kind of, again, miscalculation and just things going off the rails, you know, because China hasn't done anything. They're so worried about instability in North Korea that their caution allows things to get out of hand. And I think this is just the thing we were talking about earlier with, you know, why don't we see China in the Red Sea? I mean, they've got this situation in Myanmar just blowing up on them, on their border. They put their chips in with the junta, and the junta's in trouble. But what are they willing to do? Not much.
I think we got to come to the conclusion, right, that China is not going to restrain North Korea.
Yeah, it's probably true.
They're not going to constrain them. And so, you know, it's going to be decisions in Pyongyang that get made here to do the kind of things that Beth's talking about.
So, you know, we were just talking about miscalculation, and a few short years ago, no one used the word miscalculation when it came to Europe. But that's now changed, right? But now that's changed, right, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is that another? So that's another place where we, you know, not only what's going on, you know, between Russia and Ukraine, but that seems like another place where miscalculation could quickly escalate. Do you guys believe that, or not so much?
I mean, for me, I think that, you know, what happens in Ukraine is absolutely of strategic interest to us, and it's much more important to the United States and to our role in the world and where things are headed than even the Middle East, right? I just think that our strategic interests are there, and some of my best friends who are Middle East experts say the same thing. Yes, we have to manage what's going on in the Middle East, but, you know, Russia is still a huge threat to us. And I just got back from Latvia, and I'm telling you, like, the idea that Russia can reconstitute and threaten the Baltic states, you know, it feels really pretty real there.
They certainly feel it, right? They certainly feel
it. And there's a lot of history that supports that conclusion. The Poles feel it.
Yep.
And, you know, I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I have not felt that Russia would go after NATO, but the reasons for them not going after NATO could change.
Yeah.
Right? If we don't have Article 5, then who cares?
And may have already weakened somewhat, right? In terms of a perception about the U.S. resolve.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just think that there's so much at stake there, and yet it is not going well.
Is it, Beth, is it irreversible at this point?
I think that where we are is just that we need to kind of maintain as much as we can, which is not enough right now, support for Ukraine so that, you know, that they can go to the negotiating table. But going to the negotiating table next year's, they're not going to be as strong as if it could extend to 2026. I just don't know if that's realistic or not.
Yeah.
I don't think people talk about how the delay in funding, that huge, long months and months and months of not funding really put them behind. And then, you know, the underlying issue of manpower problems in Ukraine, which is something that they just could not get their heads around and deal with soon enough.
Yeah.
And that is something you can't arm your way out of.
Yeah.
Outside the Baltics, do you think the Europeans, do they understand the threat, or are they not so concerned?
Yeah.
Where do you think they come out?
I think
Either of you, I guess.
I was just in Berlin as well. I think that the leadership really gets it. But I don't think the public does.
Yeah.
And I don't think that there's a lot of leadership right now in Europe. You just kind of look around the capitals and either governments are kind of lame duck or weak, Germany and France. You have the UK, but they're out of the European system in many ways. They definitely get it. But, the countries that get it sit on the border, the publics that get it. I mean, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, these countries all have comprehensive security where their publics are literally preparing to and practicing and having exercises with the public and civic society about what they're going to do if they are invaded. They are restarting conscription. It is amazing what they are doing and the plans that they are making. So I do think that certainly all those countries get it, but if you go south of France, it's like, what? Who cares?
Yeah, that rings true. But I was at a conference in Germany. And it was a EU, so you had lots of not every member, but lots of European countries, except of course the UK, and they were lamenting that they thought that the populations in their respective countries were, this was just something you read in the newspaper, and then you just move on. They said there was no sense of urgency.
None.
Yeah.
But who creates senses of urgency?
Leaders.
Leaders do. Leaders do.
Leaders
so, and we have a problem with parts of Europe not getting China either. Right? And we have, in Europe, we have, Hungary and Slovakia, and the Czech Republic is likely to get a government in that's more pro-Russia.
Can I maybe ask the last question here, which is, to what extent do we think the troubled world that we just described is a result of trends that have occurred outside of what's happening in the U.S. and of U.S. policy? And to what extent is the troubled world a result of it? Would the world be a fundamentally different place today if the U.S. had not backed away from the long-term leadership role that it once had?
Well, it seemed to be it would be like region specific. I don't know if so. What would we have done differently that would have slowed or changed the rise of China? I'm not really sure. Right? Your point earlier about the Middle East and us being absent, well, that clearly has probably made things more challenging. But if you look at Asia, could we have changed the rise of China? I mean, they were on their own trajectory. So I don't know. I guess we could have hammered them with more sanctions. I'm just not sure we could have altered the scenario there. As far as Russia, I don't know. That's an interesting question. Would they have invaded Ukraine under different circumstances? I don't know.
Yeah, see, I think that we kind of overstate the centrality of the United States sometimes in how countries and leaders think about their interests and what they want. I think that what we do affects our ability to influence and, maybe to use force. But but I don't think that like you can really trace back and say, oh, if this president had been in, this would not have happened. Maybe there's some specific things you can point to, but would Russia have invaded with a different president? Yes.
But could have a more aggressive U.S. response to the invasion.
I think you have to trace it back
Would
further
we do
in
in a
history.
different place? Or even back to 2014, right? And
Or
the Obama administration
2008.
didn't. Yeah.
During the Bush administration, right, in Georgia. Like it depends on when you see the arc of this particular history beginning and ending and different inflection points. And like Andy said, I think it's very specific to the place and the region and the time and the tools and all of that. But I also think like, oh, well, maybe if Europe had been pulling their own weight, which, every U.S. administration in memory has been asking them to do, maybe if they had done something after 2008 or 14, maybe if they hadn't signed on to Nord Stream 2. Like, it's not all about us.
Yeah.
Michael, I know you said that's the last question, but there's one thing that I guess we have to just touch on briefly before we finish, and that's the threat of terrorism, which, is not the same as it has been in the past, but I don't think the overall threat has, abated. It's not like we can sort of walk away and say, okay, we've defeated the forces of terrorism. I think that, could be something that certainly the next administration would have to pay attention to. Do you all agree?
100% agree. I had Christy Abizade on. We didn't talk about terrorism. We talked about all sorts of other things. But, when I mentioned that we weren't going to talk about terrorism, Christy jumped in to say that it is with us. The threat is with us. And what's happening in the Middle East is going to make the threat that exists today, which is elevated, even higher in the future.
One of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about transitions is in 1993, within 1 month of the Clinton administration, they faced the World Trade Center garage bombing, Ramzi Youssef, Al-Qaeda, and they had the Branch Davidian showdown in Texas. And that combination of things really threw them for a loop, especially so early in their administration. The reason I thought about it is because I feel like those two things today, this idea of foreign and of domestic terrorism and how linked they are in many ways, is different. But that case is like, oh, you could kind of see that happening.
Yeah.
Right? Especially around our elections. And you have, Iran actively trying to assassinate President Trump and all the people involved with Soleimani and wanting to punish this administration because of support for Israel and using Americans to and promoting and trying to steer Americans to make them more divided on this issue, but also to rile people up. It's kind of a crazy place that we are in right now with these kinds of threats of terrorism, defined maybe differently.
Yeah. Do you know the other thing the Clinton administration had was the Oklahoma City bombing?
Yeah.
Pure domestic terrorism.
Yep. And so I think those kinds of things are definitely a huge challenge to us, especially because we have foreigners, actually, our adversaries, coming into our space, trying to impersonate Americans, pay Americans, manipulate Americans.
I don't think any of us, talking here on the podcast would be surprised if we woke up tomorrow and there'd be a terrorism attack of some sort in the United States. But I think the vast majority of Americans would be.
Yeah.
And that's another problem, right? Where we haven't talked enough about this. Not us, right? But
Right.
the administration has not talked enough about the growing risks.
No. And I know we want to end right now, but we did not talk about Mexico. And I really feel like, we need to say something about Mexico and how central it is to the concerns of either administration, from immigration to fentanyl to, the new judicial reform and nearshoring and all of these things.
To instability.
To
right?
instability.
100%.
And it's just so important to us, our number one trading partner, as well as a place that the bilateral trade is so integrated. And the threat of, of President Trump of sending people back over the border, even though most of them do not come from Mexico. But we have a lot going on in our own hemisphere. And I just think that corporations and people are not understanding that we have very near-term things that could be partly of our own making, and then we have the USMCA that has to be renegotiated by 2026, and a lot in between.
And a lot of dynamics going on in the whole region, right, that aren't favorable to us. And we don't focus on Mexico. We don't focus on the region. We don't focus on Venezuela. We don't focus on any of that because there's so much else going on in the world.
Exactly. And every administration comes in and says they're going to make Latin America a priority, and none of them have. But we need to.
Yep. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We really can.
Well, that was a really interesting discussion. Anybody who might be in incoming administrations listen to this, they're going to realize that if they're part of the national security team, they actually can't sleep. They won't have.
If they thought about it, they actually wouldn't want a job.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah,
I do not want to have a government job ever again.
100%.
All right. Well, thanks, Michael and Beth. It was great discussion.
This is a great discussion. We could have talked for another 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah, easy.
Yeah.
But then we need to drink.
Next time we should drink while we're doing the podcast.
That was Beth Sanner and Michael Morrell. I'm Andy Makritis. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters. And you can always reach us at intelligencematterspod@gmail.com.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.